Hi everyone, my name is Matt and welcome to my channel. Lately I've been trying to work on some of the models in my pile of unpainted plastic. Last week we tackled some long neglected Nurgle models, and this time I wanted to go back to the old world with this Bretonnian Lord on a Pegasus. We also have a set of recipe cards to go along with this video, and you can download them and print them out. Details about how to get them will be down in the description below. The first half of the video will be beginner friendly, and we'll use mostly contrast to paint the model to a battle-ready quality. In the second half, we'll spend a little more time and add some highlights. So let's grab our brushes and get started. This model would be way too difficult to paint while fully assembled, so I opted to paint it in a few sub-assemblies. The Pegasus, the rider, the shield with part of the reins attached to it, back of the saddle, and the base. It took quite a while to assemble and align the parts, especially lining up the reins. After assembling the model, I mounted the parts to corks and undercoated with a bright white primer. I began by painting the Pegasus and wings with one of my favorite white mixes. This is a mix of about 1 part storm vermin fur and 4 parts contrast medium. It makes a very light, warm gray. I'd like to get some slightly darker tones on the wings, so I painted another layer of the previous mix, focusing on the wingtips and the bottom of the legs. It's really easy to blend the paint. Apply plenty of paint to a small section at a time, rinse the brush, dry it off on a paper towel, and then use the clean brush to soften the edge of the wet paint. Next, I painted Black Legion on the hooves. Use a really sharp brush and do your best to get between the locks of fur. I painted the leather straps next with Gore-Grunta fur. This color is fairly transparent, so you may want to paint a second layer if you want it darker. Next, I painted the wood areas with Cygor brown. I painted a layer of basilicanum gray on the gloves and saddle cloth, and after the first layer dried, I painted a second layer. Then I painted some dark oath flesh inside the visor. There will be 2 different shades of red on the model, and Flesh Terror's red will be a good base coat for both of them. Some contrast paints can look streaky and uneven, especially over large flat areas. I find that short, quick brush strokes can help make more even looking results. I'll start with a fully loaded brush and block in the large central area. Part of the reasoning behind this is to unload some of the paint off the brush. As I work around the section, I can go back and pick up some of the excess paint. Once I block in the center of a large area, then I'll move on to the edges. The red has 1 base coat and it's looking pretty uneven, so I diluted it with some water and applied a glaze layer. Even with a second layer, it's not going to be as perfectly even as an opaque paint. This is one of the downsides to using contrast. It's quicker to lay down a base coat, but sometimes it comes at a cost. We'll leave the red for now, and if you want to even out the finish more, I'll show how to do that later in the video. Next, I painted a layer of Aggaros dunes on the cloth behind the saddle. You could paint a second layer if you want a deeper color, but I think I'll stick with 1. I want a really smooth, deep black on the fabric, so I base coated that with a standard black acrylic paint. For a very deep black tone, I prefer using regular acrylics rather than contrast, but you could use a contrast paint if you want, such as Black Legion. Before I paint the other areas, I painted a narrow black line around them. This is a technique called blacklining, and it will provide a lot of extra definition to the model. It can take some time to do, but I think it's worth it. If you want quicker results and you're not planning on doing highlights later, you could skip this step. Next, I painted a black stripe on the lance. I've seen some people use a thin strip of masking tape for this kind of thing, and you could try that if you like. I'm going to try and paint it freehand. I like the look of the box art, and the stripe gets wider as it gets lower on the lance. I started off by painting some diagonal lines along the side, and when I was happy with the spacing, I turned the model and continued the lines. It can be tricky to get the angle right so the stripe lines up when you get around to the other side. This is one of those things that I think just takes a ton of practice, and eventually you'll be able to eyeball it. Next, I base coated the steel areas with iron hand steel, and after the first layer dried, I painted a second for a bright, even finish. I shaded the steel areas next with a custom mix I call Armor Wash, and if you want to see how to mix it, check out this short video here. This is a mix of equal parts Ratling Grime, Contrast Medium, and Lamian Medium. If you don't feel like mixing anything, you could use Nuln Oil instead. Before I painted the gold areas, I added a narrow black outline wherever I thought it needed extra definition. Then I painted the gold with Retributor armor, and after the first layer dried, I painted a second for a bright, even finish. Next, I shaded the gold with Dark Oath Flesh. Contrast paints work great for shading metallics. Dark Oath Flesh is a very similar color to Reikland Flesh shade, but much stronger. I like deep shadows, and I found I was having to apply 2 or 3 layers of flesh shade in order to get the shadows I wanted. With Dark Oath Flesh, I can get the shade I want with just 1 layer. Next, I base coated some of the fabric trim with Averland Sunset, leaving a narrow black outline. After the first layer dries, you'll want to paint a second or maybe even a third layer for a solid, even finish. I shaded the yellow areas next with a layer of Cassandora Yellow. Next, I base coated the white areas with gray number 8 from my custom grayscale, and you can learn how to mix your own set in this video here. This is a very light gray that's almost white, but not quite there. It's basically a whole pot of white paint with a few drops of black paint mixed in. Next, I shaded the white areas with a mix of 5 parts contrast medium and 1 part rust gray. If you don't feel like mixing anything, you could use apothecary white instead. It's similar, but a slightly different color. I painted it all over on the small areas, and on the large areas like the flag, I painted a transparent glaze directly into the recesses. Depending on how strong your mix is, you may want to paint a second or third layer for deeper shadows. At this stage, you could assemble the model and call it finished, but I'd like to add some highlights, so let's keep going. This model is going to have 2 different shades of red, a brighter red with orange highlights, and a deeper crimson red with pink highlights. Let's work on the brighter red first. I began with a glaze of Mephiston red. Dilute the paint with plenty of water, about 2 or 3 parts water to 1 part paint. With barely any paint on the brush, apply thin layers, one on top of the other. There should be very little paint on the brush, and it should dry almost as soon as it touches the model. The paint should stay exactly where you put it. It shouldn't run or flow off the brush, and it shouldn't pool. The brush will deposit a little more paint at the spot where you lift it off the model, and I like to take advantage of that by moving the brush towards the area I want more paint to collect. Build up the layers, working towards the highlights, and painting progressively smaller areas until you get a smooth, blended effect. Now is a great time for me to ask you to do those YouTube things that we all love so much. If you're liking the video so far, please give it a like. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future content. If you really like what I'm doing here and want to support the channel further, please consider Patreon or a YouTube channel membership. We have some perks including a Discord server, printer-friendly PDF files of our new recipe cards, and early access to videos. The red is looking really smooth now, and next I highlighted the edges with a sharp line of Evil Sun Scarlet. Next I painted an even sharper line of Fire Dragon. This color is a big jump up in value, so the line has to be very sharp and narrow. If you can't paint a line this sharp, that's okay. I would recommend using a mid-tone first instead. Something in between this orange and the last highlight color. Wild Rider Red would be a good choice. Now for the Crimson Red. I diluted corn red with about 2 parts water and built up a few thin glaze layers to smooth out the surface. Some of the lines on the lance are a little uneven, and I touched those up with corn red as well. Next I highlighted the edges with a mix of about 4 parts corn red and 1 part Bonewhite. I want the fabric to be a deep crimson color, but I also want the added definition that highlights provide. So I want to make sure the highlights are really sharp and narrow, otherwise the deep red will end up looking pink. Using a warm color like Bonewhite in the mix instead of pure white will also help keep it from looking too pink. I highlighted the edges one more time with an equal parts mix of corn red and Bonewhite. Next I highlighted the edges of the saddle fabric with Bonewhite. I'd like to go with neutral gray highlights on the black fabric, rather than warm or cool grays. I began with some glaze highlights of gray number 1 from my custom grayscale. This is just a tiny step lighter than black, sort of like the opposite of gray number 8. Just a few drops of white paint and a whole pot of black paint. I diluted the paint with plenty of water, and with barely any paint on the brush, I built up some thin glaze layers just like I did on the red fabric earlier. Next I highlighted some of the edges with very sharp lines of gray number 2. If you don't feel like mixing anything, Eshin Gray is very close to this mix. I want the fabric to look very dark, so it's important to make sure these highlights are very sharp. I painted one more highlight with gray number 4, and if you don't feel like mixing anything, Dawnstone is a close match. This shade of gray is much lighter than the last highlight color. I think that the bigger the jump up in value, the more accurate the mark needs to be. I highlighted the edges of the yellow next with Moon Yellow. I'd like to make this stripe look more interesting, so I painted some very narrow parallel lines for an embroidered looking effect. Next I highlighted the edges of the leather with a sharp line of rat skin flesh. I picked out some of the wood grain next with Steel Legion Drab. Before I highlight the edges of the steel, I painted a glaze style highlight with Iron Hand steel. Shades will dull down the reflective shine of the base coat, and this glaze will restore the shine. I think of it kind of like polishing the armor. Next, I highlighted most of the edges with a narrow line of Stormhost silver. Moving on to the gold next, I painted a glaze style highlight with thinned Retributor armor. I highlighted the edges of the gold next with a mix of 4 parts Stormhost silver and 1 part Retributor armor. If you don't feel like mixing anything, you could use something like Liberator gold or even Stormhost silver on its own. Next, I painted the rivets with slightly thinned black paint, followed by a dot of Stormhost silver, leaving a narrow black outline. I usually like to save the white areas for last, because white has a tendency to smudge and stain more than other colors. I began with some glazes of gray number 8 on the smooth areas of the Pegasus. Dilute the paint with plenty of water, and with barely any paint on the brush, build up some thin layers to lighten the raised areas, and also use it to smooth out wherever the shade dried unevenly. I used some less diluted paint to highlight the feathers next. The smaller feathers have no texture sculpted on them, so I'm just going to pick out the edges and go for a smooth look. The larger feathers have texture sculpted on them, and I highlighted all of those areas. I also added a few extra lines here and there for extra detail. I want to emphasize the darker wingtips with a faded kind of effect, so I concentrated more of the highlights near the base of the long feathers. As I worked my way towards the ends of the wings, I gradually eased pressure on the brush to make the lines more faint. I want the fabric to be a much brighter looking white than the Pegasus, so I'm going to use pure white on the fabric only and avoid any more highlights on the Pegasus. You could paint glazes of white paint if you want to, but I like highlighting just the edges. I think the light gray is bright enough, and hitting the edges with pure white adds some extra definition, which I like. I also added a tiny dot of white in the corner of the eyes. Next, I painted a very subtle glaze of Bugman's Glow on the end of the nose and around the mouth. It's really easy to overdo this kind of color shift, so make sure the paint is diluted with plenty of water and have barely any paint on your brush. Then I painted the teeth with Bonewhite. I used a decal setting solution to apply a couple transfers to the model. And after they dried, I painted a layer of Lamian medium over the top to reduce the shine. I carefully assembled the model with super glue next. Make sure you have very clean hands when you do this part. It's easy to smudge the model when you're handling it like this, and you may need to scrape some of the paint off the joints in order for the parts to fit together. I used an old brush to apply a generous amount of wood glue to the top of the base, and then I sprinkled on some coarse gravel and fine sand. After the glue dried, I painted the base with thinned Rhinox hide, followed by a dry brush of Mournfang brown, and then Xandri dust. I painted the rocks with Dawnstone, and then shaded with a mix of Agrax Earthshade and Nuln Oil. I painted the edge of the base black, and then added patches of static grass with superglue. I'd like to give a big shout out to our supporters here on YouTube and Patreon. Thank you so much for your support. It really is a huge help. If you want to be like these amazing people and help support what I'm doing here, just click the join button down below or follow the Patreon link in the video description. Thank you. I really enjoyed revisiting the Bretonnians. It's been too long. Using contrast paints made the Basecoat stage go by a lot quicker, especially for the Pegasus. However, I think that traditional opaque paints are a much better option for the cloth. I had to spend a lot of extra time fixing the red, when I could have just painted it with a solid base paint to begin with, like I did for the black, white, and yellow cloth. This is a case where I think it's a good idea to mix techniques. Use contrast base coats for heavily textured areas, and opaque paints for broad, smooth areas. What do you think? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy painting.